I need to talk to you about a party you had here last night.
How many more people are gonna have to die horribly painful deaths?
We are talking the day after Halloween, and this is a horror comedy directed by Chad Ostrom, and it was written by Danny Schluck, who also has a role in the movie. Now, this film has been described as The Hangover meets Halloween. I would say there's a little bit of very bad things in there as well. And, well, what's the story? Well, it kind of focuses on these two guys who are kind of friends, and they are, you know, guys who like to kind of rib each other a little bit and kind of have this kind of somewhat of an antagonistic relationship, you might say. And they have this kind of big Halloween party, and the next morning they wake up and discover there is a woman dead in the shower unit. Who is she? What are they? How did she get there? What actually happened? They'll have to try and figure it out. And is there a supernatural element involved? Well, you'll have to watch the movie to find out. So, what do I think works in this movie? I'll be honest with you, not very much. This one was a tough watch. It's a very, very dialogue-driven movie. It's a low-budget film, and they clearly haven't got the budget to have special effects, set pieces, lots of location shooting, different kind of things happen in the movie. So it relies heavily on the script in regards to its kind of like its character work, its dialogue and its acting, and unfortunately those things are somewhat lacking, but we'll go into a little bit more detail in that in just a minute. Do I think there is anything that works in this movie? I think when you have a dialogue driven movie, and you know the great example here is you use The Top of the Tree, which is kind of like a Tarantino film, alright? So if you think about that, you have the direction, you have the script, and then you have the kind of the acting involved here. And if you have all three of those things working well, you'll get an interesting movie. So it is possible to have a strong film that is low budget, dialogue driven, but you have to have those three things in place. And this is why I think sometimes with low budget filmmaking, you know, if you're kind of, if it's a low budget film, you either have to have a cracking script, cracking direction, and decent actors to make this no-frills kind of movie work, or you've kind of got to try and go for a more visceral or schlocky kind of route. This one is trying to be a dialogue-driven movie, but it fails, unfortunately, on some of this. I would say at the three areas that I've talked about, the direction is probably the strongest. There's some directorial choices here, having the movie kind of take different segments of time, you know, in different orders. So it's kind of jumping back and forth into kind of the time frames. It makes it at least have some type of directorial choices that are involved here. You know, with these again with these kind of visually, we have these kind of big sort of like timer that sort of comes up on screen to tell you how far away this scene was taking place and stuff. I think it's a little confusing, but at least there was some directorial choices here that were kind of, you know, that were made, which I think it makes it. It tries to have it a little bit of its own kind of voice, at least. Some of the jokes I think were okay. Some of the kind of the visual gags, as a guy dressed up as like John McClane, for example, and he makes a kind of quite a funny gag about Die Hard. So there's a couple of jokes that kind of worked for me, and I kind of see what they were going with. Certainly with our two kind of central characters, one of which is kind of has a very kind of like dry, sardonic kind of sense of humour. I can see what they were trying to do, but if I transition to what doesn't work now, it doesn't work. This movie doesn't work. The best thing about this, I would say, is its attempt to have some directorial flourish, but even that, I would say, is flawed, and it's partially down to, I would say, the other areas, the script and the acting, but the actual direction here, the choices to have this movie kind of take place over various kind of different kind of times is confusing. It kind of jumps back and forth. You have actors that aren't particularly well, or characters that aren't particularly kind of well established, that I have to say look quite similar at times. And you're thinking, I don't know who these people are, you know, what's going on. Everyone's kind of, it's so just dense and dialogue driven with these characters that are very indistinguishable. You just kind of think, I don't kind of like you can't hardly really follow it all that easily, if you ask me, because it's like, it's poorly put together. But at least there were some choices. At least there was some type of directorial flourish there, despite I think it kind of failing. The real problem here is the characters themselves are not developed. We go into this movie and we have all this, again, it's very dialogue driven. We have these kind of introduce these characters. They don't really stand out. They have real kind of no real persona. What we do have, I think, falls kind of quite flat. Everyone kind of seems very kind of samey. They kind of the casting, I would say, needed to be a little bit more diverse in regards to these kind of like who's who. Everyone kind of just blends into kind of one. The acting isn't strong, unfortunately. When you're having a character-driven dialogue movie, you need decent actors. And although I wouldn't say the acting is like downright awful, it isn't strong. You know, these characters don't really have any type of real kind of believability behind them. Now, I know this is meant to be a comedy movie, but it's still, we need to kind of buy into the characters. For example, when we have the sequence where they discover the body, there's just nothing there. There's no real kind of shock. There's no real kind of like emotional kind of resonance to it. It seems like, oh, there's a body. Oh my God, what are we going to do? You know, that's kind of all we really get. And that's also down to the script, which I also think is pretty poor. This to me strikes me as a film where it had a very kind of tight-knit group of people who were making it. They knew what they wanted to put on the screen. And I've said this many times with lower budget films. You know, people like just go, yeah, that's great. And then they put it to screen and you watch it going in cold like I have. You're thinking, this to me is just not interesting. It's just not an interesting film. There is a supernatural element that is brought in, but I think it's brought in too late. What it is kind of visually not very interesting at all. I think a lot of the jokes kind of just fall flat. There is some of these sort of like comedy sequences, so to speak, are so drawn out. You know, it just seems, there's for example a sequence where one of our characters is getting played with by a female character, and it just goes on and on and on and on and on. It's just like, that would have been funny for like 10 seconds, but not for kind of 5 minutes or however long it goes on for. It's just drawn out. Although I think a couple of the jokes land, a lot of them don't. They're delivered quite poorly by the actors, and the script, unfortunately, is just all over the place. It's hard to kind of like follow because your attention just isn't there. And this is the point. It's like, you know, the story ultimately isn't particularly kind of dense necessarily, but because the decision was to take it with all these kind of different kind of time frames with uninteresting characters and an unengaging script, you lose kind of concentration. You think, I'm not really that interested, so you're not particularly kind of paying attention. So it becomes a real slog, and ultimately you're not really paying attention. This movie, unfortunately, was a bit of a slog to get through. This needed to have more people kind of like pushing back on some of the decisions there, and it needed to be more interesting. This movie wasn't interesting on screen. It was too dialogue driven. The dialogue wasn't good enough. The script wasn't good enough. The acting wasn't good enough. And if that's the case, then you need to have more stuff actually happening on screen. So it's kind of the worst case scenario, really. A dialogue-driven movie which doesn't have a good script, it isn't well performed, doesn't really have much visual kind of style on it. For me, this was a 3 out of 10, and you know, I feel like I'm giving some marks here for some attempt at having some visual flair, but you know, to me it is the bottom of the barrel, this film. Didn't enjoy this one. It was a real slog to get through. 3 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.